Our world is lost in unnecessary fear and hurt. Our systems seem scientifically engineered to make you small, powerless, and always waiting for the next great leader who will fix the problems around us. Worse, we're witnessing neighbor versus neighbor while warfare breaks out around our family tables. But you have access to a spirit, a strength that enlarges and empowers you. Even better, you don't need to wait for the next big movement. You can heal the world. It's time for governance by grace. Welcome to Gracearchy with Jim Babka.
I want to go kind of hardcore here on policy. I want to talk about like what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. I want to argue with you a little bit because I think that the policy of prohibition, and this is my long considered experience on this question and my time spent studying it, is it's dangerous and bad. It simply doesn't work. It doesn't deliver any of the things that people who claim to be for it believe that they're getting out of the process. So I really want to go hardcore on that. You've done a really good job in this book of laying out some things. I mentioned earlier that there were two arguments that you had that I thought you contributed something to this field that you were very articulate in. I want to make sure we get the other one of those in before we go. But I'm going to start with this thought. I wrote this down as soon as you said it because it was like, wow, this is something I want to sit and meditate and ponder. And Bill, I think you're going to enjoy this one too. Longing for justice is longing for beauty. Why'd you include that line in the book?
I was sitting in Sunday school one Sunday, and one of our assistant pastors was teaching at the church that we used to go to. And he was teaching on the things that our hearts long for. And I bet you I can still name them all. He had 6 of them: beauty, intimacy, belonging, home, adventure, and glory. He said those are these kind of 6 longings of the human heart. Now, they're not going to be, we're not going to see the fulfillment of those until heaven. And yet there are things we pursue on this earth that are filling some of those longings. And the week that he taught about beauty, he said, I think actually that the longing we feel for justice is really a longing for beauty. It is the longing for things to be made right and good, for things to be as they were supposed to have been before the fall, where right and goodness and justice really is a for things not to be disordered, not to be unfair, not to be someone taken advantage of, for things to be made right. And that rightness is something that we experience as beauty around us. And that resonated so much with me because as I started inviting people to book discussions, which is the first thing I did when I changed my mind, I started using Johann Hari's book, Chasing the Scream, and invited people to come to book discussions and discuss that book. I did not feel the kind of typical crusader, like I'm going to go organize a protest. That was not at all my heart or what I felt drawn to. I felt drawn to it because my heart was broken for what felt like the responding to human suffering in a way that increased human suffering. And that was a sad thing to me. I wanted that to be made right. I wanted for people to be able to experience their own value, for people who are struggling with addiction, not to look at themselves and say, I am a terrible person. How could I be doing this? But to say, I am a person made in the image of God who is valuable and worthwhile and of more value than I could possibly even imagine. And he loves me even though I am struggling with this addiction. And when I heard my pastor make that connection, that justice and beauty, that longing for justice is really a longing for beauty, that felt to me like it resonated with why I cared about the issue. It wasn't because I was angry. It wasn't because I wanted to, to go round up the troops and go fight someone. It was because it felt like it was a deep disordering, a deep marring of the picture as it is supposed to be. And I wanted to be part of trying to stop that from happening more and try to reclaim and rebuild the beauty that was supposed to be, the way of responding to my fellow image bearers in a way that helps them to see their value and to live out that value, to live into the beauty that God created their life to be. Why did it stand out to you, Jim?
It stood out to me because I'm trying to make connections all the time. My brain's a connecting brain. And I like to, contemplate profound, what are seemingly profound statements to see if they really are profound and understand it. And I think I love your answer, but I think everybody has their own definition of beauty too.
Sure. It's subjective.
And the danger is imposing that it's not just their own sense of beauty. Then they also start to think that they can figure out how to construct it, right? So it should look like this, and then this is how we'll do it. And that doesn't end up working. It doesn't end up working in any relationship that we have, that we somehow or other believe we can construct this whole thing. All three of my kids are grown. And every one of them has made at least one choice in their adult life. I'm going to be gentle and say at least one choice that I would prefer they had not made. Like, I wish they would handle something differently. But as a parent, I got to sit back and kind of accept that they're adults trying to figure out their way in the world. Either it's a part of a process. In a couple of cases, there were things that they needed to learn the hard way. In other cases, it was, this is who they are. It's just, they're human beings kind of like trying to function in the world. And then I have to remember back to when I did the same thing to my dad, right? I could question, you were talking about when we very first opened our very first part of this discussion, you were talking about, arguing with your mom over swimsuits. Oh, holy cow. I argued with my dad over a whole bunch of things. It just, and my dad argued with me. It's to the point where people around us would be like almost shocked at how we spoke to each other. We were never rude, but man, were we direct. And I've noticed that not everybody appreciates directness in my life. I've had to learn how to manage that. At times I can be an acquired taste. But this beauty that you're talking about, I think everybody thinks that they want that. I think everybody's got their own picture of it and what it looks like. And I think everybody's intentions here, even the most zealous drug warrior believes at the end of the day that they're doing the right thing. They're doing the proper thing. They're doing the considerate thing. And this is why I think it's the right way to have a policy discussion. I don't want to deny their felt reality, but I would like them to know that good intentions ain't enough. Mm-hmm. And so, I just want to throw some things at you. The first one that I wanted to throw at you is, does jail save life? Okay, at least we could throw them in jail and that'll give them time to clean up their act. And, that's good for them. We'll throw them in jail and their life will get better because we'll interrupt their process of drug taking and addiction. What do you do with that?
So there are some people for whom they would say jail saved my life. Well, I have no way of disproving that. So I'm going to give them the benefit of that doubt and say it did save their life. I would say, well, okay, then what about for the other people? If you are incarcerated and released, you're 12 times more likely to die of an overdose than you were if you had not been incarcerated. Now, you are also more likely to die of an overdose if you have been abstinent in drug treatment and then relapse. So the abstinence portion is a really big deal. If someone is abstinent, their body tolerance goes down for what they can handle, and there's no way for them to know. So they might take the same amount of opioids that they took before they were incarcerated or before they were in treatment, and now it can kill them instead of actually just.
I know someone exactly fits this bill. Mm-hmm. Her name was Felicia, and she told me straight to my face, if I go back to the life I lived, I will die. She didn't. Instead, she ended up having amputations because she caused severe problems, and then she died.
Yeah.
So I know I get what you're saying there.
Yep. So it can. So there are some people who would say, "Hey, that was just the thing I needed, and it really turned my life around. And without that, I would be dead." And there are other people for whom it caused their death. I don't think it is an overstatement to say that, because the statistics bear that out. And so when we force someone to be abstinent from a drug, we are forcing them into a much higher risk category for death. We should take that really, really seriously. That is not something to play around with. And that, I think, is such a important piece of this deep desire we have to force people to make the choices we want them to make related to substance use, because we're willing to do almost anything to force them to make a choice for a period of time. And we think, well, if we just arrest them, that will force them to be abstinent. Sometimes that's true. It can be true in the beginning days of someone's incarceration. Sometimes they'll put people in solitary confinement and let them go through withdrawal. It's inhumane what people are exposed to in incarceration environments related to going through withdrawal without medical attention, without help. So to me, I just think, that sitting with that and saying, is that really what we believe is our, not just our responsibility, but our right to put someone in a situation where they're more likely to die? I have a very difficult time with that. That is really challenging.
And this isn't the only issue. Three more immediately creep to mind. One, what happens when they get back out again? How do they get back into life? And we haven't made this easier. Like, if you have a criminal conviction on your record, your ability to get employed, sometimes we've taken away the very license, or we've limited the number of occupations. Like, our government went on a very active tirade during the 1970s and 80s and 90s to really crack down on drugs, really super hard. And we've closed a lot of doors.
Yep.
So, like, if you're trying to get back, okay, I've messed up. I really want to be sober. I've been in a program. I'm practicing the program, whatever the program is, and it's working for me. But now I can't find a job, and those stress factors and traumas start to return.
Yep.
That's one. Yep. You noted in the book that law enforcement has told you, you've had people in law enforcement tell you, well, we keep arresting the same people.
Yep. I had a dad tell me his son has struggled with addiction for 30 or 40 years now. The father is probably 80, and his son, I think, is his late 50s. So he has been using since he was early teenage years. And the dad called me one day, and he lives in rural Mississippi. The first time I talked to him, he was on his tractor. And he calls me every now and then to give me updates on his son. His son's incarcerated currently on a possession charge. And he called one day and he said, "You know what I was thinking? The fact that we have these habitual offender laws related to drugs, isn't that proof that this is the wrong approach? If it solved the problem, you wouldn't have habitual offenders who keep getting arrested on drug charges. But the fact that they do keep getting arrested means this is not the solution to their problem, and it's just making the problem worse." To your point, yes, and drugs are readily available in jail. So sometimes we can keep people abstinent for a few days if you put them in a particular environment. But I have someone come and tell me who's been incarcerated where they did not have access to drugs because they're everywhere. And most people will say they were easier to get on the inside than they even are on the outside, because at the inside, you don't even have to go anywhere. They just show up to where you are.
That's exactly right. And then is your organization, I asked this question because I have a question I want to make sure I ask correctly. Are you really focused on Mississippi right now, or are you beginning to start to take your reach to more of a national level?
Yeah, we're in between. We've done a lot of work in Mississippi and have just seen a lot of interest in the message being brought to other places. So we're beginning to do more work, particularly educationally, on just reaching people outside of
And that's End It for Good, and your website is?
enditforgood.com.
Okay, so the reason I did that was I want to make sure I asked this question correctly, but it turns out I don't know how to ask the question now, given the answer you just gave. So speak to this into the way that you understand. about incarceration rates. I was going to ask about whether it's Mississippi or U.S., but like, what is the drug incarceration rate, particularly the nonviolent? Like, you're just talking about people having possession charges type of thing. Like,
Yep.
how many people do we have in prison?
Yes, I'll give you a little Mississippi snapshot. So Mississippi has the highest imprisonment rates, period, in the country. So we have more people in prison per
Oh, that's
capita
something to be proud of.
than any other state. So unfortunately,
Yeah.
last night I was doing that discussion in Louisiana. Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate. So when you include, city and county jails and all of that, they have more people incarcerated per capita. We just happen to unfortunately win on the prison front per capita. So we're in a high use of incarceration. It's not because Mississippi is a particularly dangerous place to live. We fall right in the middle on crime rates, but we are very high on incarceration rates. So if you look at the year,
okay, wait a minute, hold on a second. I want to get these stats, but let's go back up to what you were just saying a moment ago. If we have more people in prison in those locations, the way the math should work out is that there would be far fewer people addicted outside the walls.
Right.
Is that happening?
No. So we have had rates of illegal drug use in Mississippi have doubled in the last 20 years.
Okay,
That's
wait. That math shouldn't work. Like, that math absolutely should not work. It's like gravity. Like, you got a principle here. If the people are in the prison, there shouldn't be more of them out because we're putting them in the prison. So they can't put them in prison fast enough, because the more they put them in prison, the more we get. I mean, like, it's just a weird thing. It doesn't match beauty, does it?
No, not in anyone's definition of beauty, I would say. Even if we all have our own, it is not. So then if you look at, well, why are people going to prison? We like to think it is violent offenders, even on the drug front, it's for trafficking charges, things like that. So if you look at the last year that Mississippi has full data that's publicly available is 2022 for why people entered prison. So about a third of people who entered prison in Mississippi were there on some sort of drug charge. And we think, well, prison, you're getting at least a year. You're going to come out with a felony. That's got to be trafficking charges. No, more than half of those drug charges are possession charges.
Okay, wait a minute. Just to make sure the math is holding here. 1/3 of the people there are for drug-related offenses, and half of those.
Yep.
So roughly 16% of them are simple possession.
Yep. So that makes possession the number one sentence for which people entered prison in 2022. There's lots of other crimes people are, sentenced to prison for, but drug possession is more people were sentenced for drug possession than any other crime in Mississippi in 2022. So that breaks down to about 1,500 people being sentenced that year, just that year, entering prison. That doesn't include all the people in city and county jails. It doesn't include all the people already in prison. These are just new people entering prison. There's about 1,500 in that year, 2022. Their average length of sentence was 6 years. Their average age of sentence was their mid-30s. So we're removing people in their prime working years of life. Now, did they all have jobs? I have no idea. I'm sure some of them did not have jobs, but we are taking people out of their lives when they're most likely to have children growing up, when they're most likely to be able to be working and providing for themselves for lengthy periods of time. And then they're going to come out again. And what's going to happen to them? And this churn of people that's just going in and out, 1,500 people. And all those people are connected to children and to families and to parents and to jobs and to, or if not jobs currently, certainly future opportunity. They're going to come out. They're really not going to be able to work after that because they're going to have a felony.
There's also a maturity factor here. I don't know exactly what age females become adults, but for guys, it's pressing 30. In many cases. I actually know the moment I became an adult. I was 29 and a half years old. Like I was already married. We already had 2 kids. There were a lot of things that I was doing back then, or ways that I was handling situations that I wouldn't use today. There was a point at which like it all just kind of came together. I got my stuff together in a way. And I've talked to a lot of guys. A lot of guys have experiences like this. Maybe it's not as like they can't pinpoint it down to a moment, but they know that, when they were in their early 20s, they were borderline I don't want to use the R word, but they were stupid. All right. They were dumb. They made a lot of stuff. So there's rash decision making that's going on in the 20s that'll settle down. And we know this from the crime studies too. We know that violent criminals, the level of violence for males tends to go down sometime around the time they turn 30.
Oh, yeah.
So
Precipitously down. Yeah.
Yeah. So like we're locking people up in their teens and 20s and setting up what? We're not like there's like we should be helping people to get to the bridge to that next station, right?
Yeah. And interestingly about the kind of age and stage. So this is not well known. So people tend to think, well, if someone's struggling with an addiction, the only way they get out of it is if they go to treatment, if they're incarcerated, or they're going to die. Like those are the three options. It's not true at all. The vast majority of people who exit an addiction do it without going to treatment. And most of them, they do it in their late 30s. So it's called spontaneous recovery.
Wow.
And we don't hear those stories because it's not this immediate like,
Well,
I
how
was
are you
on
going
the
to package and
street,
sell that?
and then yes, and then I went to treatment and ta-da, look at my amazing life now. It is the evening out of a life over as you hit that kind of getting out of your 20s. And maybe for some people that took a little longer to get through that stage of life, things begin to even out a little bit. And people do exit addiction all the time without going to treatment. And they may not even call it an addiction that they were dealing with. They might not even want to identify in that way with that. Maybe people that they love would say, yeah, there was problematic use there for a long time that they just really, didn't want to admit or pay attention to or whatever. But that, so it is not true that if we don't forcibly intervene in a person's life, that they're just going to forever be addicted or they're going to die. What reality is if we can just help people to stay alive, most of them will recover on their own without intervention.
Okay, but you said just a few minutes ago that the number one category for being put in prison is possession.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, possession is not the same as addiction either. So
Right.
there could be a wrong place, wrong time. Like, oh, I got busted the third time in my life I ever touched the product. It could be that there are people, just like there are social drinkers, there are social consumers of various narcotic products. And to add insult to injury in all of this, you mentioned this out loud in the book. You have interacted with people inside the penal system in Mississippi who were there for a marijuana charge, and marijuana is legal in the state now.
Yeah.
So there's a whole host of other types of things that are not, we're talking about beauty here, that are not, they're just kind of life. Like people are just doing their thing and like wrong place, wrong time. And all of a sudden we're going to turn them completely upside down and show them.
Yeah. I think that's, if I could pick two things that I think are just by 99.9% of the American public not understood, they have no idea that this is reality. One of them would be that that most people recover without treatment, and most people do it as they age out of addiction. And the other one is that most people who use drugs do not become addicted to them. That the rat park experiment is most people's experience with substance use. Even when you get into drugs like cocaine and heroin. Now, that's not at all an endorsement of saying that they're not higher risk. They certainly are. But it is just to say, statistically speaking, the vast majority of people who try any drug never become addicted to it. Most people who try a drug don't end up using it even repetitively. If you look at the number of people who have tried cocaine ever in their life, and then the number of people who have used it in the last year, the graph goes from this to this. There's a lot of people who tried it and don't use it anymore. And if you start listening for those experiences, you hear them all around you. You'll hear people who will say, yeah, in college, I dabbled in some stuff. Like for a year there, I was really into cocaine. And then I thought, I'm going to really screw up my life. I better stop this. And I just moved on. And in one little phrase like that, you're hearing if they had gotten caught at the time, There you go. That's a drug possession charge. That could impact the whole rest of your life. But when you hear the context that they're telling it in, it wasn't an addiction. It was, hey, I hung out with these friends at a certain point and we really got into this thing. And then I realized, yeah, this isn't going to turn out well for me. And I moved on and did other things. So it is not to say there aren't risks, but when we think that everyone using drugs is addicted to them, we get responses like forced treatment if they're arrested. Well, that's a complete waste of treatment to send someone who is not addicted to addiction treatment. We need those beds and those opportunities for people who actually have an addiction and for people who are ready and want to be there. So when we force people into that experience, we're, it's interesting. You think about the experience of the people who want to be there. In addiction treatment, you're with other people. You're often doing group work. Imagine what that's like to be the person who wants to be there and is trying to get sober. And you're surrounded by a bunch of people who were forced to be there and don't care and don't want to get sober. That makes it even harder for the person who wants to be there to be able to maintain that sobriety. You're in a dysfunctional system where some people choose it and a bunch of people are forced. And so they're just there because the judge says they've got to be there. That's again, back to that people being forced into things. And I think with the issue of substance use, we have conflated, any kind of consequence with criminal justice consequence. There are lots of consequences in a person's life that they're going to experience if they struggle with an addiction. We don't have to include forced consequences to that. You might lose your marriage. You might lose your job because you can't perform in your job. You might lose your housing because you're spending all your money in, to feed your addiction and you're not making your house payment. Those are all natural consequences to your own choices. Those are not things someone is forcing upon you. So people often think when we talk about not incarcerating people for drug use, they think, well, there's no accountability. You're just going to let them do whatever they want.
Yeah.
No, not at all. Their life is probably going to be really hard and they're going to lose a lot of things if they don't get help for that. But we don't have to forcibly include incarceration in that. We don't have to forcibly make their life even harder than it's already going to be, because the natural consequences of unhealthy decisions will fall on them. We don't have to make it even harder.
I want to take this policy thing in a different direction. Now I want to talk about economics, and I want to talk about hard realities, gravity. This is science in action, right? I mean, certain things lead to certain consequences or results. So my epiphany, Christina, actually happens in July of 1996. I too was raised in a Christian home. And so I was presented watching television, and I already had a friend that was involved in the Libertarian Party. And I had decided I couldn't vote for the Republican nominee that year, which was a big deal for me. And I'm sitting there watching television, and I became interested in what the libertarians were offering. But I said, I'm a Christian. I can't be a libertarian. And the morning after, Harry Brown, who I would end up going to work for 4 years later, was on C-SPAN's Washington Journal with Brian Lamb. And he said out loud that something to the effect of, you don't have Jim Beam dealers doing drive-by shootings on outlets that sell Jack Daniels. And if I was a cartoon character, like the light went off over my head. I was like, whoa, okay, I got it. Like there's no contradiction here. Because again, the thing of beauty is we don't want people, like beauty by definition, we don't want drive-by shootings, right? That's something that would ruin the beauty, the picture of justice there. There's never really a choice between prohibition and legalization, is there? I mean, there's certain things that are going to start to happen. For example, gangs.
Yep. I remember, and to your point earlier about a bill for my heart changing and then my mind changing. So I had, as I read about the economics of an underground market, I remembered that I had actually had someone explain to me a couple years earlier, before I met Joanne, what happens when you prohibit something that's popular and then it moves underground, and why there's violence. And they were explaining it in the context of drugs. And I listened to it and I thought, that kind of makes sense and I don't care. And it just, went one ear in one ear and out the other. And I didn't even think about it again until my heart was changed. And then when I started reading and learning, I came back to that and thought, oh, this is what they were talking about. They were talking about when you prohibit a popular drug, the market doesn't go away. It just moves underground. And now it can't be, it can't be governed by law. So it's just governed by force. And so you basically get what happens when there is no respect for the law or for people's rights, because in an underground market, you get the most piece of that pie, of that cash. If you are violent, as much as you can force your way into it, that's how much money you can make. There's no incentive to be kind. There's no incentive to be to think in the best interest of your community. The incentive is cold hard cash, and the most cash goes to the person who owns the most routes and who has the most people working for them. And who and how are you going to get that? Well, you're going to have to be the guy that everyone else is afraid of. And how do you get people to be afraid of you? And how do you get ownership of those routes? Well, you have to take that by force. So as I learned about that, it expanded the way that I thought about the human impact and the lives that were affected by it, because I saw it's not just people like Joanne who are struggling with an addiction. It's people who are living in these communities where this underground drug market thrives. That may not be the community that I live in, but it's communities around the world where millions of people live, where they are literally in fear of their life because of the criminal activity that is happening. I remember one of the interviews that I did for the book was with a man whose mom grew up in Colombia. And as a girl, so this was during COVID, so we were doing the interview virtually, and he leaned forward and showed me the little charm that was on his necklace. And he said, "Do you see this? This charm is the outline of the country of Colombia. And on the back of this charm is my mom's blood type. When she was a girl, the violence from the underground cocaine market in Colombia was so great that even though her family was not involved in drug trafficking at all, but so many civilians were getting killed in the crossfire and the violence that was surrounded that underground drug market, that citizens were encouraged to have their blood type somewhere on their body, either as a tattoo or something like that. So as a girl, she wore this necklace all the time with her blood type on it. That is mind-boggling that people live in that kind of fear who are not doing anything wrong themselves. But because of drug prohibition, we have empowered and incentivized the kind of violence that people have to live under. And I think that is a terrible evil that is in the world today.
Johan Hari in Chasing the Scream does an excellent job of showing that how the United States has exported this policy to the world and made this an issue all over the place where it might not necessarily have been, places like Colombia. But it always comes down to a choice as to who distributes, not whether or not it's going to be distributed. It's who's going to do the distribution. And there are a couple of things to say about that. First, you make this point in the book. We recognize that in economics, this is already well understood, that if you regulate something, you get less of it. And so prohibition is the ultimate regulation, I think people tend to believe. But that's not true.
It's the absence of any kind of regulation.
Yeah, because the gangs are running it.
Yep. Yeah, I totally thought it was I always thought of prohibition as the ultimate regulation. Like if something's really bad, then we prohibit it, and that way it goes away. And part of it I think is some just naivete for people like me who have not used illegal drugs. I think there's a lot of people who because they're not looking for those illegal drugs, they assume they must be kind of hard to get. Like, sure, people can still get them, but they're not in my community. And in reality, we don't see them because we don't want to see them. The minute I started looking for marijuana, or I started looking for cocaine, or I started looking for heroin, it would be right there. There was a guy who, so I live in the county I live in is the most affluent county in Mississippi. We have lots of poverty in Mississippi. I live in the Jackson area, just north of Jackson. So the county I live in is very affluent. And there's a man that I met who had just gotten out of prison for selling drugs. And I was just listening to him tell his story. And he told me the neighborhood that he lived in, very nice neighborhood. He said, oh yeah, me and my wife lived there, had a nice house there. And, I had a job, but I realized that there was a whole bunch of people in this affluent city, and they didn't want to have to travel to the tougher parts of town to get the drugs that they wanted to use. They were a bunch of doctors and lawyers, and they wanted to use drugs that are illegal, but they didn't want to go get them. So I just became the middleman. I wasn't using the drugs. I just saw kind of a business opportunity to say, hey, I will go drive the 10 miles to the neighborhood you don't want to go to, and I'll bring the drugs back and I'll sell them to you, and I'll make a profit, and you don't have to go where you don't want to go. And so, you look around in the community I live in, and you don't see that happening. You don't see those deals happening on a street corner kind of thing,
Right.
because that's not how it happens in more affluent places. But it's happening all around us anyway. We just don't see it. So it's easier to pretend that it's not really happening when really it's happening. And now, what are people getting? Well, they're contributing to an economy that is putting hundreds of billions of dollars a year into the hands of people who are breaking the law, and creating all kinds of wreaking havoc on public safety. Prohibition is about the worst thing that we could do for public safety. If people are worried about crime and violence and they want to increase public safety, moving drug markets out of this underground world and back into some sort of legally regulated markets is one of the best things that we could do to increase public safety.
Yeah,
It has increased public safety in a deregulated state where you can buy marijuana at a dispensary, but it is more expensive to follow the law and buy it legally and get product that isn't as good versus the street. So we have to get to this balancing point somehow, right?
Yep.
And I think you make a good case for that in the book.
Yeah, and there are, when you look at even like the marijuana market, you look at different states who have had, varying success with that. And by success, I would say, are they putting the underground market out of business in those places? And some states are not doing a good job of that. Their regulations are so tight, their taxes are so high that the only people who are going to buy it legally are people with a lot of expendable income because everybody else says, I'm not going to pay those prices. And yet we don't see that with alcohol. We don't see this persistence of an underground market because we have found, look, there's still lots of problems with alcohol, but we've found this sort of happy balance where it's taxed, but there's not enough demand for anything other than legal alcohol where cartels would be producing that. So I think that always gives me hope in these other markets and with the marijuana
that would be how you
too.
would begin to regulate that, right? I mean, if you're going to try to find that balance point, you're going to be looking at driving the illegal trade out, and that would tell you kind of what the natural market price should be, not some artificial.
Are people willing to? People want to buy regulated products. They would prefer to know what is in the drug that they're using, but consumers always own. I think that's, people will often say, just because you would allow people to buy drugs legally, cartels are still going to want to sell them. And I always say, well, sure, they're going to want to sell anything they can because they want to make money. But consumers hold the keys. Consumers will decide, am I willing to keep buying illegally? Or am I willing to participate in a legal economy? It has to be a viable option for them or they're not going to take it. So it doesn't matter if we want consumers not to buy from the underground market. It doesn't matter if we wish that they would pay exorbitant prices for products that are taxed so highly they're unaffordable. Consumers are gonna tell us whether or not they think that the legal options are actually working. And if they're not, then it is up to us to make that a viable marketplace. If the goal is to put these underground, cartels and gangs out of business, people that are breaking the law, we have to make it viable, like we have with alcohol, where people are okay. They're okay with the prices they're paying for legal alcohol. They're okay with the regulations they have to jump through for legal alcohol. And it doesn't matter that cartels wish that they could sell alcohol. Nobody wants to buy it from them.
The last economics question I want to ask you here is about the Iron Law of Prohibition. I told you I thought there were two things that you contributed where you did a really good job. I had not come across the analogy that you had used. So explain to the audience, what is the Iron Law of Prohibition? Because it's a really significant economic factor here, and share with them the analogy that you prefer to use. You're describing that. It's just delicious. I thought it was so good. Everybody can relate to this, especially in Mississippi, right?
Yeah.
Go to a college ball game. Go ahead. I don't want to ruin it for you.
Every time I'm doing this presentation, when I get to this part, everyone cracks a smile. It immediately, yes, yep. Everyone understands what's happening here. So the Iron Law of Prohibition is not that's not my term. It's been around for many years, but basically anytime that you prohibit a popular substance, it's going to get more and more potent. So the harder you enforce prohibition, the more you crack down on it, the higher and higher potency it's going to get. And that's because if you have to smuggle something, you want the biggest punch in the smallest package because you have to avoid detection. So if you think about alcohol during alcohol prohibition, you couldn't buy low potency alcohol during the years of prohibition. It wasn't worth smuggling. People were just making high potency alcohol. But in the years before prohibition and after prohibition, by far the most popular forms of alcohol are their lowest dose varieties of beer or seltzers, things like that. It's not that some people don't like hard liquor, but during prohibition, that was all you could get because no one is going to risk smuggling. So you can see that playing out today because we have these little microcosms of alcohol prohibition, which are sports stadiums where you're not allowed to drink inside. So when people are tailgating...
Well, you're not allowed to bring outside drink in.
Right, yes. In some of them, you're not allowed to drink at all inside. There are still some that just have no alcohol in them.
Right.
Particularly in college sports stadiums. So you have people who are tailgating and they are drinking beer. The vast majority of people who are tailgating are drinking beer. But when they pass through the gates and prohibition starts, they're not allowed to legally drink inside. They don't take beer with them inside. They smuggle hard liquor. Why is that? Have their tastes suddenly changed? Did they prefer to drink beer while they're tailgating and suddenly they just really want to get hammered during the game? No, it's just because prohibition started and they're making the same evaluation that everyone else who sells illegal drugs is making. And they're thinking, how can I get the most intoxication with the least amount of risk? Because I can't get caught. So immediately when you introduce the risk of getting caught, you're going to get higher and higher potency substances, which is why we have fentanyl in the underground drug supply. Fentanyl is far more potent than heroin. And so you have cartels that figured out how to synthesize fentanyl. It can be made anywhere. You don't need a crop to produce it. And you can create lots of it. And a very small amount of it can get thousands and thousands of people high. Now, that also makes it really dangerous because the margin of error between getting high and dying is razor thin with fentanyl. So it's a very dangerous product to have in an unregulated environment. Mm-hmm. And yet we see with fentanyl has been used for decades in hospitals, in every hospital in this country, every single day. Nobody ever heard about it because it did not cause a problem. When it's used in a medical setting with trained people who know how to administer it, it's a very helpful opioid that helps people who are having surgery, who are in recovery from surgery, who need pain management. But when it's on the street, now what's happened is it has created consumer demand for fentanyl. We would never have consumer recreational demand for fentanyl without drug prohibition. It would have never made that jump into the just vast consumer market.
And this is incredibly important. This is the last area of policy I want to cover with you, but this is so let me just set this up by saying drug prohibition is inherently not a conservative position. It's conservative moralism, but it might even be some paternalism that conservatives, I believe, will, if we crack down, we can make something go away. But we've already blown away those arguments here. The fact of the matter is, it's done a lot to damage civil liberties. It's done a tremendous amount to grow the government and make it much more powerful. And the government trying to fight this war instead of treating this economically and medically has entered into a lot of arenas it wouldn't have entered into otherwise, and your civil liberties have shrunk, and the seeds of new projects have, new law enforcement initiatives. A lot of the ones that end up coming and snagging other things and causing trouble that we don't like today their roots can be found in the war on drugs. But there's a new specter that's on the scene over the last decade. And Republican politicians in my home state, I'm from Ohio, I've noticed since the early 2010s, have been campaigning against first heroin and now fentanyl. And they're trying to do everything they can to constrict people's access to pain management medications. So we literally have a situation now where we have law enforcement figures with no medical training making decisions for human beings that their doctors cannot make, and doctors in fear of losing their license, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's a really tragic backlash that has happened because we had some doctors who were prescribing too many opioids to people. Pill mills were a real thing. The vast majority of doctors were not engaging in that activity, but there were some who were. And so the backlash to that has been to crack down on legal prescriptions. So it's almost like we have expanded the drug war. We've been fighting against drugs that we have made illegal, and now we're fighting against also drugs that are legal. And what that has done is two different things. One, it has pushed a lot of people to get their opioids on the underground market because they can no longer get them legally, which means they're using far more dangerous and potentially deadly drugs than they would have been if they were under the care of a doctor. Even if they're struggling with an addiction, even if their doctor said, I don't think you're actually using these opioids medically anymore. Isn't it much better for a person who is struggling with an addiction to be under the care of a doctor than to be on the street going to a drug dealer to get their drugs?
You would think so.
That just makes no sense that at a point where a person needs healthcare the most, we sever them from that healthcare relationship and say, you're out of here. I can't treat you anymore. So that's one thing that's happened, which is part of the reason why we have those increased rates of illegal drug use, because the legal supply has been squeezed, but the underground market is just tickled pink. They're very happy. That's more customers. They would love it if we didn't allow anyone to access.
And you tell a story about someone who basically was at a fork in the road where they had two bad choices to make.
Yes. Yeah. A friend of mine, a guy that I went to college with, who struggled with severe chronic pain over a medical condition that he had. It was so bad that he was considering suicide, had already decided how he would commit suicide when he got to that point of just not being able to deal with the pain anymore. And regularly ran into this problem of people not believing that he was in the amount of pain that he was in. And because of this sort of belief that, these are just, quote unquote junkies who, so he would go to the emergency room and the doctors would tell him, I'm sorry, but, we're risking, being, for the DEA to come after us if we prescribe too many opioids. So we just can't help you. So there's very real people like him who are suffering. So people either who are suffering because they can't get the amount of drugs that they need, because opioids really do help some people. We've lost sight of that we think these are just bad. They're not just bad. They're a friend of mine, he's an author as well, Tim King, he says, we need to think about drugs more like fire. Fire can be incredibly helpful, but it is also risky. It can be really destructive. We don't need to think about them like COVID, which has like no positive impact at all. We just want it to be gone. And we have responded to drugs often like a COVID sort of problem, where we think the goal is just to be done with them forever. And that's not really what we want, because they really can be incredibly helpful in certain circumstances. And we don't want to deprive people of the very real positive impact for people like Will, who are, pain patients who need them to be able to have a functioning life. And we have many instances of people who have committed suicide because they could not live with the physical pain that they had to deal with, and they could not find a doctor who would be able to treat them. And maybe like Will, Will is if there's more people more straight-laced than me, Will would have been one of them. He said, I didn't have a first clue how to go buy an illegal drug. I wouldn't have even known where to start. So in his mind, suicide was the only way out, because if he couldn't get relief, he didn't know how to get it any other way. So there are so many fronts where this war on substance access, substance use, substance markets, it is impacting all of us. It's like a blanket that covers the world. Whether you think it impacts you or not, it is impacting you. It affects your community. It affects crime rates. It affects whether or not people can get jobs, whether they can have access to higher education, all kinds of ways. Jim, to your point from earlier about there are so many ways it has infiltrated our life that we have said, okay, maybe this will make people not use drugs. Let's take away their access to grants and loans for higher education if you've got a drug charge. Maybe that will stop them. Let's take away their driver's licenses. Maybe that will stop them. Well, what's that going to do? All that's going to do is make them have to turn to selling drugs, because they can't even get to a job, even if they could get one. If they're, it just for years in Mississippi, if you had a drug charge, your license was revoked, even if it had nothing to do with driving. That helps no one. It helps no one. It just is part of this mindset of, if we just make life harder, somehow people will make a better choice. And I became convinced that it's not true. Just experientially, it isn't true. Statistically, it is not true. And also, I don't think that is the path that we're called to as Christians. I remember thinking, and I talk about this in the book a little bit too, I remember kind of coming to this realization that, I guess it isn't that we should be trying to make laws out of everything the Bible says. And I think I thought that was kind of the ultimate goal growing up, was the goal is to kind of bend the will of the state to be in line with the will of God. And then I started thinking about the 10 Commandments and thought, well, not even we would think it was crazy to make, coveting illegal, or, worshiping a false god or something like that. Now, certainly there's some people that would want to make that illegal, but I think generally speaking, Christians have not been lobbying for the 10 Commandments to become criminal, laws if you break them. And when I realized that, it was for me this kind of light bulb moment of realizing this is not the goal. The goal is not to try to force everyone to obey what I believe God calls us to, whether or not they're a believer. It's not the role of the law. It's not what God asks for us to go do in the world. He doesn't say go and try to bend the will of your country to force people to follow me or follow after the ethic that I teach. So I think, our laws certainly are informed by our worldviews. There's no way around that. All of us bring who we are and what we believe to the table. But we, to your point about beauty, everyone has kind of a different take on what they think is, harming someone else or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I really think it's important for Christians to think long and hard about the role of the force of the state. I heard an interview recently with a man who wrote a book. He's an attorney, and he said, I just think people do not realize that the criminal justice system is a system of forced violence in a person's life. And he's not speaking, to my knowledge, from any kind of libertarian perspective. He
Nope.
just said, if you think about what happens is if you don't comply, we exert violence upon you. You know,
Yep.
if you try to run away, you will be met with violence. If you try to get out of this, you will be met with violence. This is not to mention what people experience inside jail and prison, which is often significant amounts of violence from other inmates. They tend to not be well supervised. And so I thought that was a really helpful thing, because I don't think most of us recognize that. I think we think of, we just want people to act right, and we're going to send them to this environment where they are really taught how to act right. And we really just don't. I think we're maybe have been a little bit lazy and maybe just a little misled on the role of how we really are to live out our faith in the public square. And that
I think
the
that's
goal is
vitally-
not to make sin illegal. There wouldn't
No.
be anybody left to guard the prison.
No, there wouldn't. And it's interesting, because I don't think we've thought about all the implications of what we're doing. The chief one you just brought up, which is that every time we've made a law, we've decided that we're going to coerce. It's the only thing that the state really brings to the table. Any social problem we want to address, we have the ability to go out and do it. And that's what you're beginning to do. A quick plug for your organization. What are you doing now? What are your plans, and how can people get involved?
Yep. You can come join us. If you go to enditforgood.com, you can sign up for our newsletter. We send everything out that way, and we only send it out every 2 or 3 weeks, so we will not spam your inbox. But we send out information on events, on volunteer opportunities, on things that you can be part of, giveaways, all kinds of stuff. The vast majority of our work is educational. So if someone is listening and you are connected to another podcast, to a university, to a conference where you think this message would resonate or be something that's important, reach out to us and let us know. You can always email us at curious@enditforgood.com. Curious is the name of my book. And that's also just a way that you can reach out, because a lot of what we're doing this year is related to talking about all of the ideas that are in the book. So our goal is to get these ideas and this message in front of as many people as possible, because people can't make more informed decisions until they are informed. So we're trying to help people understand why prohibition creates so many problems, and why moving away from that is actually going to get us to a place where we are more in line with the values, whether you're a libertarian or whether you're conservative, or whether you're progressive. We all win when fewer people are dying, when there's less crime, when people have their health issues handled in a way that actually helps them overcome those health issues. So come and join us there. You can find us on social media at End It for Good MS, and we would love to connect with you, hear your thoughts, and connect with wherever you are connected to, because so much of our work has come through the connections of other people who have introduced us, who have brought us into spaces, like the church where I went and did this discussion, last night. It's just people taking a little bit of a risk and saying, hey, I wonder if my community would be open to this, and bringing that conversation into audiences that might not have thought about it before. That's something that all of us can do, whether or not we end up being in your location or not. You can share a copy of the book with people. You can share this podcast episode with people. There are lots of ways that you can help bring this message to more people, because policy changes when enough people change their mind. If we want to see policy change on this issue, more people have to change their minds and voice that change out loud. Politicians are always testing the weather. What is going to get me elected? What's going to make me lose my seat? And until they feel the pressure of their constituents saying, we are tired of this. We're tired of people dying. We're tired of having all of this crime and just perpetuating it even more. We want a different approach. When they hear that from enough people, that's when we will start getting a different approach. There's a lot of money on the side of drug prohibition. A lot of money is made in lots of different areas for as long as we keep drugs illegal. It's not just cartels that are making money.
Yeah.
There are a lot of legal industries, prison industries, law enforcement. There's lots of money
Asset
for them.
forfeiture. Yep.
Yes, asset forfeiture. There's all kinds of ways. There are lots of forces that are pushing against this change. So if this is something that you think needs to happen in the world, this is up to us. This is up to regular citizens voicing that we need to make this change. And that, ironically, is how everything has ever happened in the world where there has been positive change. It's regular citizens who come together to say, we don't want to live this way anymore. This is not how we want our neighbors to be treated. This is not the way that we want substance use to be handled. And we are going to speak up until we see those changes happen.
Bill and I have both read this book, ladies and gentlemen. It's called Curious by Christina Dent. We haven't covered everything that's in it, believe it or not, in the episodes that we've recorded here. But we would strongly encourage you to read it. And there's a bonus. If you get the Audible version of this, Christina herself narrates it.
Yep.
You found
Beautiful.
out how
Awesome.
Oh, beautifully. Yeah. And you found out how pleasant she is to listen to. But Bill, we discussed this. I felt her talking, like the emotion
Yeah.
in each of the passages. This was not a narration, professional narration. It's a real human being talking. You can feel her heart coming out through this book. And I think the most significant thing about it,
thank you,
is that we have an audience that if we could turn this audience on this issue, the tide turns. This is the kind of the last audience, so to speak. If you believe that good intentions cover everything, then politics would always solve everything. Because everybody that shows up to do this has their cause, whatever that cause is. The ones you hate too, they're after this beauty that we've been spending the last few minutes talking about. And it doesn't work. And an area, and we have just scratched the surface today. I promise you, with the conversation that we've just had with Christina, we have scratched the surface on the ways that this has harmfully impacted our society and corrupted our government. So I would encourage you, this is a discussion that needs to be had. If you are a believer, this is a great book for you to check out. If you are not a believer, this is a book you still want to check out so that you can share it with friends. Christina has contributed to the overall debate, as you've heard today, and she's reached an audience that matters. So, Christina, thank you very much for joining us. And everybody, enditforgood.com. Curious, it's available everywhere.